Close your eyes. I want you to imagine standing on the western coast of Norway in the year 985 AD. It is late summer, the last week of August, and the light here does something that you have never seen if you have only ever lived in the lower latitudes. The sun does not set so much as it sinks to the edge of the world and then slides sideways along the horizon, painting the sky in bands of amber and rose and pale green that last for hours. The fjord in front of you is black and still, so calm that it reflects the mountains on either side like a mirror, doubling the world, and the mountains themselves are enormous, sheer walls of dark granite rising straight out of the water, streaked with waterfalls that catch the late light and turn to gold. The air smells like salt and pine and the faintest trace of wood smoke drifting down from the farmstead behind you. You can hear sheep somewhere on the hillside above, their bells faintly clanking. You can hear the creak of a ship's hull rocking gently against a wooden dock. And you can hear voices. Men's voices, low and serious, coming from the longhouse at the top of the meadow where the grass is cropped short by grazing animals, and the wildflowers are just starting to fade. These men are planning a voyage. Not a raid, not this time, though raids are very much part of their world and their reputation. This is something different. This is a voyage of discovery, an expedition into the unknown Western Ocean, toward a land that a handful of sailors have glimpsed through fog and storm but that nobody has ever set foot on. And the man organising this expedition, the man whose voice rises above the others in the longhouse, is a 25-year-old Norseman named Leif, the son of a man called Erik, who is called Erik the Red because of his hair and possibly because of his temper, and who is himself an exile and an outlaw, and the founder of the most remote European settlement on Earth, a tiny colony clinging to the southwestern coast of Greenland, like a barnacle on the edge of the known world. Leif Erikson is about to do something that will not be repeated for another 500 years. He's about to sail west across the North Atlantic, find a continent that no European has ever seen, step ashore, build a settlement, spend a winter there, and then sail home and tell everyone about it. He's about to discover America, 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus was born. And here is what makes this story so extraordinary, so haunting, so perfect for a night like tonight, when you're lying in the dark and letting your mind drift across the centuries. The Vikings found America. They walked on its beaches, they drank from its rivers, they cut down its trees, they met its people, they built houses and lit fires and slept under the same sky that is above you right now, and then they left. They walked away from an entire continent and never came back. Why? That is the mystery at the heart of tonight's story. And we're going to walk through it from beginning to end, from the fjords of Norway to the frozen coast of Greenland, to the fog-shrouded shores of a land the Norse called Vinland, the land of wine, a place that scholars have spent centuries trying to locate, and that was finally definitively identified in 1960, when a Norwegian husband and wife team of archaeologists found the ruins of a Norse settlement at the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Meadows, and proved beyond any doubt that Europeans had reached North America half a millennium before Columbus set sail from Spain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you to the world that produced these voyages, because you cannot understand what they found in America unless you first understand who they were and what they were looking for and what kind of world they came from. The Norse world in the late 900s AD is not what most people picture when they think of Vikings. The popular image of Vikings as nothing but bloodthirsty raiders in horned helmets, which they did not actually wear, is about as accurate as describing all Americans as cowboys. Raiding was part of the Norse economy, yes, particularly in the earlier Viking Age, from the late 700s through the 800s, when Norse raiders terrorized the coasts of England, Ireland, France, and beyond. But by the late 900s, the Norse world has evolved into something far more complex. The Scandinavian homelands of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark consolidating into kingdoms. Christianity is spreading, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes by the sword. Norse traders have established commercial networks that stretch from Constantinople to Baghdad, from the Volga River to the coast of North Africa. Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, have sailed down the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, establishing trading posts and eventually founding the state of Kievan Rus, which will evolve into modern Russia. Norse merchants have reached the markets of Constantinople, where they serve as the elite Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, and they have travelled the Silk Road as far as Baghdad, where Arab writers describe them with a mixture of admiration and disgust, praising their physical strength and commercial acumen while deploring their personal hygiene. The Norse world in 1000 AD is not isolated. It is deeply connected to the wider world, embedded in trade networks that stretch from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from the coast of North America to the markets of Central Asia. Norse coins have been found in India, Norse artifacts have been found in Persia, and Norse DNA, carried by the traders and raiders and settlers who spread across half the globe in 3 centuries of explosive expansion, is embedded in the populations of Russia, Ukraine, France, England, Ireland, Scotland, and a dozen other countries. The Norse are one of the most mobile and most globally connected peoples of the medieval world. Norse settlers have colonised Iceland, establishing a republic governed by an elected parliament called the Althing, which first met in 930 AD at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart, a site that was chosen for its central location and its natural amphitheatre of rock walls where speakers could be heard by the assembled chieftains. The Althing is one of the oldest continuously operating legislative bodies in the world, and its creation tells you something fundamental about Norse political culture. These were not people who submitted easily to centralised authority. They governed by consensus, by law, by argument, and by the collective decision-making of free men who considered themselves equals. The Icelandic Commonwealth had no king. It had no standing army. It had laws and lawyers and a legal system of extraordinary complexity, codified in memory by a law speaker who was required to recite the entire body of law from memory over the course of 3 years at the annual assembly. This is the political culture that produced the Vinland explorers, and it explains both their strengths and their weaknesses as colonists. They were fiercely independent, enormously capable, and constitutionally unwilling to take orders from anyone. These are good qualities for an explorer. They are less good qualities for a colonist trying to maintain a fragile settlement 1,000 miles from reinforcement. The Freydis episode, with its internal violence and its betrayals, may be the clearest illustration of this problem. When you take a group of fiercely independent, headstrong, violence-capable Norse individuals and put them in an isolated settlement at the edge of the world, with no external authority to mediate disputes and no escape from each other except the ocean, the potential for things to go catastrophically wrong is enormous. The same qualities that made the Norse extraordinary explorers, their courage, their independence, their willingness to use violence, made them difficult colonists. They could discover a new world. They could not share one. The Norse are not just warriors. They are farmers, fishermen, traders, shipbuilders, poets, lawmakers, and explorers. And they are very, very good at crossing oceans. The key to everything is the ship. The Norse longship is one of the most remarkable technological achievements of the medieval world, and you need to understand it to understand how a handful of Scandinavian farmers ended up on the coast of North America 1,000 years ago. A Norse longship is built from overlapping planks of oak, each one split from a single log with wedges and axes, never sawn, because splitting follows the natural grain of the wood and produces a plank that is both stronger and more flexible than a sawn board. The planks are fastened to a skeleton of ribs with iron rivets, and the gaps between them are caulked with animal hair soaked in pine tar. The result is a hull that is simultaneously strong and elastic, a ship that does not fight the waves but bends with them, flexing over swells rather than slamming into them. And this flexibility is what makes Norse ships capable of crossing open ocean in conditions that would destroy a more rigid vessel. A fully loaded Norse longship draws less than 3 feet of water, which means it can sail up rivers, cross shallow bays, and beach on any sandy shore. It can be sailed, rowed, or both. It can carry 30 or 40 people, plus cargo, livestock, and supplies for weeks at sea. It has a single square sail made of wool, often dyed in stripes of red and white, and when the wind is right it can make 8 to 10 knots, which is remarkably fast for a vessel built entirely of wood and iron and wool and animal products. The ship is also beautiful. The Norse lavish care on their ships the way other cultures lavish care on their cathedrals. The prow is carved, sometimes into the head of a dragon or a serpent, and the hull is sometimes painted in bright colours. The ship is not just transportation. It is a symbol of status, of identity, of freedom. When a great chieftain dies, he is sometimes buried in his ship, surrounded by his weapons and tools and personal possessions, and the ship is covered with a mound of earth, and the two of them, the man and the vessel that carried him across the world, go into the ground together. The Osberg ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway in 1904, is one of the most beautiful objects ever created by human hands. It was buried around 834 AD with two women, one of whom may have been a queen or a powerful priestess, along with an extraordinary collection of grave goods that included a richly carved wagon, 4 elaborately decorated sleighs, tapestries, kitchen utensils, agricultural tools, and the skeletons of 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 small cows. The ship itself is 70 feet long, its hull carved with intricate flowing patterns that combine animal forms and abstract geometry in a style that is purely and unmistakably Norse. The prow rises in a great spiral of intertwined serpents that seems to grow organically out of the wood, as if the ship were a living thing that had been frozen in the moment of its greatest beauty. The craftsmanship is staggering. Every surface that could be carved has been carved, with a precision and an artistic vision that rivals anything produced in medieval Europe. The Osberg ship was not a warship. It was a ceremonial vessel, too lightly built for the open ocean, designed for coastal waters and sheltered fjords. But it tells you everything you need to know about the Norse relationship with their ships. These were not merely functional objects. They were works of art, expressions of identity, vessels for the living and vessels for the dead. The ship is the heart of Norse culture, and every voyage is an act of faith in the ship and in the knowledge of the sea that has been passed down through generations of sailors who learned to read the waves and the winds and the behaviour of seabirds and the colour of the water the way a farmer reads the soil and the sky. And the Norse do not have compasses. Let me say that again because it matters. The Norse sail across the open Atlantic without compasses. They navigate by the sun and the stars and by a body of accumulated knowledge about ocean currents, wave patterns, wind direction, cloud formations, the flight paths of migrating birds, and the behaviour of marine animals that tells them roughly where they are and which direction they are heading. They may have used a sunstone, a piece of translucent calcite crystal called Iceland spar that polarises light and can be used to determine the position of the sun even on overcast days when it's hidden behind clouds. Whether the sunstone was actually used for navigation is debated, but the fact remains that the Norse crossed the North Atlantic repeatedly, in both directions, without any of the navigational instruments that later European mariners would consider essential, and they did it with a success rate that suggests their methods, whatever they were, worked remarkably well. The ship is the reason the Norse were able to reach places that nobody else in Europe could reach, and it is the ship that carried Leif Erikson across the North Atlantic to a continent that would not appear on European maps for another 5 centuries. To understand the Vinland voyages, you need to understand that the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic was not a single great leap. It was a series of steps, each one pushing a little further west, each one building on the knowledge and the courage and the desperation that drove the one before it. Norway to the Faroe Islands, roughly 200 miles of open water. The Faroes to Iceland, roughly 300 miles. Iceland to Greenland, roughly 600 miles. Greenland to Vinland, roughly 1,000 miles. Each step was longer than the last, each one more dangerous, each one carried out by people who had run out of room at home and were looking for something better, or at least something different, somewhere over the horizon. The Norse expansion was driven by a combination of population pressure, political conflict, and sheer restless ambition. Norway's best farmland was limited, and the younger sons of farming families who could not inherit land had to find it somewhere else. Some went east, down the rivers of Russia, trading and raiding their way to Constantinople and Baghdad. Others went west, into the unknown Atlantic, island hopping across the top of the world toward a continent that nobody knew was there. Each new colony became the launching point for the next. The Faroes provided the knowledge and the confidence to reach Iceland. Iceland provided the knowledge and the confidence to reach Greenland, and Greenland, improbably, impossibly, provided the knowledge and the confidence to reach America. But the story of the Norse discovery of America does not begin with Leif. It begins with his father, Erik the Red, and it begins with a crime. Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red, was born in Norway around 950 AD. His father, Thorvald, was banished from Norway for killing a man, which tells you something about the family, and they moved to Iceland, which was at that time a relatively new colony, settled by Norse emigrants beginning around 870 AD. Iceland was a frontier society, rough and competitive, and Erik grew up in it and apparently inherited his father's temper. Sometime around 980 AD, Erik was involved in a series of disputes with his neighbours that escalated into killings, and he was sentenced to 3 years of outlawry by the Icelandic Assembly. Outlawry in Norse law did not mean prison, it meant exile. You were cast out of the community, stripped of legal protection, and anyone could kill you without penalty. You had to leave, and you could not come back until your sentence was served. Most outlaws fled to the wilderness. Erik the Red did something different. He had heard stories, rumours really, from sailors who had been blown off course in storms, about a large land mass to the west of Iceland. Nobody had explored it. Nobody had mapped it. Nobody even knew for certain that it was real. But Erik decided that, rather than hiding in the Icelandic highlands for 3 years, he would sail west and find this land for himself, and he did. In 982 AD, Erik the Red sailed west from Iceland and found Greenland. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring the southwestern coast of Greenland, and those 3 years deserve a moment of attention, because they are one of the most remarkable solo expeditions in the history of exploration. Erik was essentially alone, or possibly with a small handful of companions, on the coast of an enormous island that no European had ever explored. He had no maps. He had no idea how big the island was, or what lay in its interior. The coast of southwestern Greenland is a labyrinth of deep fjords, some of them stretching 50 miles or more inland, flanked by mountains and glaciers and sheer rock walls that drop straight into dark water. The water itself is bitterly cold, filled with icebergs that carve from the glaciers with thunderous roars and float out into the fjords like white castles, beautiful and deadly, because a single iceberg can roll without warning and create a wave that will swamp a small boat. Erik sailed and rowed his way through this maze of fjords for 3 years, mapping the coastline in his memory, noting the places where grass grew greenest, and where the fjords were most sheltered from the wind, and where the fishing was best, and where seals hauled out on the rocks in numbers that made hunting easy. He was looking for land that could sustain a colony, and he found it in the deep inner fjords of the southwestern coast, where the mountains blocked the Arctic wind, and the Gulf Stream brought a thin finger of warmer water that kept the fjords ice-free for most of the year, and created a microclimate that was, by Greenlandic standards, almost mild. The grass in these inner fjords grew thick enough to support cattle and sheep, which was the minimum requirement for a Norse farming colony. Erik found these places and he remembered them, identifying the best sites for farming, the best harbours, the best fishing grounds. And when his outlawry expired and he returned to Iceland, he came back with a plan. He was going to found a colony. He named the land Greenland, which was and remains one of the great marketing decisions in human history, because the name suggested a lush and fertile land that bore very little resemblance to the actual ice-covered island he'd found. The medieval Icelandic sources are quite clear about this. The saga of Erik the Red states plainly that he called it Greenland because he believed people would be more eager to go there if the land had an attractive name. It worked. In 985 or 986 AD, Erik led a fleet of 25 ships carrying roughly 400 to 500 colonists from Iceland to Greenland. Only 14 of the ships completed the crossing. The others turned back or were lost at sea. Those who survived established 2 settlements on the southwestern coast of Greenland, the eastern settlement and the western settlement, in the deep fjords where the land was most sheltered and the grass grew thickest. These were not temporary camps. These were permanent farming communities with longhouses and churches and barns and pastures for cattle and sheep and goats. The Greenland colony would survive for nearly 500 years, which is an astonishing achievement when you consider that these people were farming on the edge of the Arctic, growing hay in a 2-month summer, raising livestock through winters of total darkness and brutal cold, and maintaining a European agricultural lifestyle in a place where the climate was actively hostile to European agriculture. At its peak, the Greenland colony had perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people, 2 churches, a monastery, a convent, and a bishop appointed by the Pope in Rome. Life in the colony followed the rhythms of the short Arctic summer and the long Arctic winter. In summer, the Greenlanders drove their cattle and sheep to upland pastures, where the grass grew thick in the constant sunlight, and they cut and dried hay for winter fodder with an urgency that bordered on desperation, because if the hay crop failed, the livestock would starve, and if the livestock starved, the people would follow. They hunted caribou and Arctic hare in the interior. They hunted seals along the coast, and every year they organised long-distance hunting expeditions to the Nordsetter, the northern hunting grounds far up the western coast of Greenland, where walrus and narwhal and polar bear could be found in abundance. These expeditions were the colony's lifeline. Walrus ivory and polar bear skins were the only products the Greenlanders could trade with Europe, and without them, the colony would have been completely cut off from the wider world. The hunters would be gone for weeks, rowing and sailing hundreds of miles up the coast in open boats, camping on the shore, hunting walrus on the ice floes, collecting tusks and hides, and then rowing back with their cargo before the autumn storms made the return trip impossible. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and men died on these expeditions regularly, drowned or crushed by ice or killed by the animals they were hunting. The walrus is not a passive creature. A full-grown bull walrus weighs over a ton and has tusks that can punch through a boat hull. Hunting them from an open boat with hand weapons requires skill, courage, and a willingness to accept that any hunt could be your last. In winter, the colony turned inward. The darkness came in November and did not fully lift until February. The cattle were brought into the barns, which were built attached to the longhouses so that the warmth of the animals helped heat the living quarters. The people lived by lamplight, burning seal oil in soapstone lamps, the same kind of lamp found at Meadows, and they spent the long, dark months mending tools, weaving cloth, carving ivory, and telling stories. The stories were their connection to the world they had left behind, the world of Norway and Iceland and the wider Norse civilization that existed beyond the ice. Without the stories, they would have been completely alone. It was the westernmost outpost of European civilization, a tiny island of Norse culture floating in a vast ocean of ice, and it was from here, from this improbable foothold on the edge of the world, that the next leap westward would be launched. And this is where the story of Vinland begins. According to the Icelandic sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red, which are our primary sources for everything that follows, the first European to sight the North American mainland was not Leif Erikson. It was a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he found it entirely by accident. Bjarni was an Icelandic merchant who made regular trading voyages between Iceland and Norway. In the summer of 985 or 986 AD, the same year that Erik the Red's colonists were heading to Greenland, Bjarni sailed from Norway to Iceland and discovered that his father had joined Erik's expedition and moved to Greenland. Bjarni decided to follow his father, even though he had never been to Greenland before and had no idea how to get there. He sailed west from Iceland and he promptly got lost. Fog and north winds drove him off course for days, and when the weather finally cleared, he found himself within sight of a land that was definitely not Greenland. It was low and flat and covered with forest. Greenland was mountainous and covered with glaciers. This was somewhere else entirely. Bjarni's crew wanted to go ashore. They wanted to explore, to collect fresh water and timber, to see what this strange new land had to offer. Bjarni refused. Think about that for a moment. Here is a man floating off the coast of an unknown continent, a continent that no one in his entire civilization has ever set foot on, and his crew is begging him to let them go ashore, and he says no. He says no because he has a plan, and the plan is to find his father, and Bjarni Herjolfsson was the kind of man who stuck to a plan. So he turned north and sailed along the coast for several days, watching this strange new world slide past the gunwale of his ship. He passed one landscape that was hilly and covered with dense forest and white sand beaches. He passed another that was mountainous and topped with glaciers, which he called worthless and ugly. And still he did not stop. He just kept sailing north, reading the coast the way a merchant reads a contract, looking for the clause that would take him where he wanted to go. And eventually the wind shifted in his favour, and he caught it and ran northeast across the open water, and after days of sailing he reached the Greenland settlements, and there was his father waiting for him, and they embraced, and Bjarni settled on the neighbouring farm, and that was that. He never went back to the strange forested land he had seen. He never organised an expedition. He never drew a map. This is one of those moments in history that makes you want to reach through the centuries and shake someone by the shoulders. Bjarni Herjolfsson may have been the first European to see the coast of North America, and he did not bother to set foot on it. He just sailed past and went home. But his story did not die. He told people what he had seen. Word spread through the tiny Greenland community, and eventually it reached the ears of a young man named Leif Erikson, the son of Erik the Red, and Leif was exactly the kind of person who would hear a story like that, and immediately start planning an expedition. Leif Erikson was, by all accounts, a remarkable individual. The sagas describe him as tall, strong, handsome, and wise, which is exactly what you would expect a saga to say about a hero, but the details of his life suggest a man of genuine ability and ambition. He had travelled to Norway, where he had spent time at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason and had been converted to Christianity, which he brought back to Greenland along with a mission to convert the colonists. His mother, Thorvald, was among the first converts, and she built a small church near the family homestead at Brattahlid, the ruins of which were discovered by archaeologists in 1961. A tiny turf-walled structure barely 15 feet long that is the oldest known church in the Western Hemisphere. Leif was a man who had seen the wider world, who had connections at the highest levels of Norse society, and who had the resources and the reputation to organise a major expedition. Sometime around 1000 AD, give or take a few years because the saga chronology is not precise, Leif bought Bjarni Herjolfsson's ship, assembled a crew of 35 men, and set sail from Greenland to find the lands that Bjarni had described. Think about what this means for a moment. Close your eyes and think about it. A 25-year-old man is standing on the shore of Greenland, the most remote European settlement on the planet, looking west across an ocean that, as far as he knows, has no other shore. The only evidence that anything is out there is the story of one man who glimpsed forested coastline through the fog 15 years ago. There are no maps, there are no charts, there is no way to determine longitude, there is no way to communicate with anyone once you are out of sight of land. If you sail west and find nothing, you may not have enough food and water to sail back. If you sail west and find something, you have no idea what it will be. It might be a small island, it might be a continent, it might be inhabited by people who will welcome you or people who will kill you. You have no way of knowing any of this. And Leif Erikson looks at that horizon and says, yes, let us go. The voyage itself would have taken roughly 2 weeks, depending on wind and weather, and it would have been one of the most extraordinary experiences of any of their lives. Imagine it. You're in an open boat, roughly 70 feet long and 15 feet wide, with 34 other men plus supplies, tools, weapons, and possibly livestock. The boat has no cabin. There is no shelter from the wind or the rain or the spray. You sleep on the open deck wrapped in furs and oilskins, wedged between barrels of fresh water and sacks of dried food. The ship rises and falls on the Atlantic swells, and the swells in the North Atlantic can be enormous, great rolling walls of grey-green water that lift the ship and then drop it into troughs so deep that you cannot see the horizon. When the wind is right, the wool sail fills, and the ship moves fast, 8 or 10 knots, and the hull hums and flexes beneath you, and the spray flies back over the bow and soaks everyone forward of the mast. When the wind dies, you row. 30 men on oars pulling hour after hour, the ship moving slowly through water that is so cold that if you fall in, you will be dead within minutes. When the fog comes, and the fog in the North Atlantic comes often and stays for days, you cannot see anything. The world shrinks to a circle 50 feet across, and the ship drifts, and nobody knows which direction is west and which is east, and the only thing you can do is wait for the fog to lift or for the sun to show itself through a break in the overcast so that you can take a bearing and correct your course. Navigation on these voyages was as much art as science. The Norse used a method called latitude sailing, which involved sailing north or south along the coast until you reached the same latitude as your destination, then turning and sailing due west or due east until you hit land. To maintain their latitude, they used the height of the sun at noon, measured against the gunwale of the ship or against a simple wooden bearing dial, and they used the position of Polaris at night. It was crude by modern standards, but it worked well enough to cross the North Atlantic repeatedly with an acceptable survival rate. The route that Leif followed, based on the saga descriptions, can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. He sailed northwest from the Greenland settlements, crossed the Davis Strait, and made landfall on a coast that was rocky and barren, covered with flat stones and glaciers, with no grass and no trees. He called this place Helluland, which means flat stone land, and most scholars identify it as the southeastern coast of Baffin Island, which is exactly what you would see if you crossed the Davis Strait from Greenland and made landfall on the nearest large body of land. The saga's description of Helluland is beautifully precise. The land, it says, had no good qualities. It was all flat stones and glaciers, and between the sea and the glaciers, The land was like one great slab of rock. This is an almost perfect description of the southeastern coast of Baffin Island, which is indeed a landscape of flat rock terraces, broken stone and glacial ice, one of the most desolate coastlines in the world, a place where the ice sheets of the last glaciation have scraped the land down to bare rock, and nothing has had time or soil enough to grow back. Leif looked at Helluland and saw nothing worth staying for, which is the correct assessment. He did not stay. He sailed south. The sailing between Helluland and the next landfall took 2 days, according to the saga, which at Norse sailing speeds would put the distance at roughly 200 to 300 miles, consistent with the distance from southeastern Baffin Island to the coast of Labrador. The next landfall was different, and you can feel the change in the saga's language, a quickening of interest, a note of excitement that is unusual in the normally understated Norse prose. The coast was flat and wooded, covered with forest that came right down to the water's edge, with white sandy beaches and shallow waters extending far offshore. The Norse went ashore and found the land rich and inviting. The forest was dense and green, the trees were tall, and the sand on the beaches was white and fine. This may have been the first time any of these men had ever seen a coastline covered in forest, because Iceland has almost no trees and Greenland has none at all, and the effect on people who had grown up in treeless landscapes must have been overwhelming. Imagine spending your entire life in a place where a single piece of driftwood is a valuable commodity, where houses and ships and tools must be made from imported timber that cost a fortune, and then stepping ashore in a place where the trees stretch back from the beach as far as you can see, thick and tall and uncountable, more timber than your entire colony could use in 100 years. That is what Markland looked like to the Norse. Leif called this place Markland, which means forest land, and the consensus identification is the coast of Labrador, probably somewhere near the Strait of Belle Isle. The Norse were immediately interested in this land because of the timber. Greenland had almost no trees. Timber was one of the most precious commodities in the colony, essential for building houses and ships and making tools, and it all had to be imported from Norway or Iceland at enormous expense. Here was a coast covered in forest, an almost unlimited supply of the one resource that Greenland needed most. But Leif did not stop here either. He continued south, and then he found Vinland. The saga description of Leif's arrival in Vinland is one of the most vivid passages in all of Norse literature, and you can feel the wonder in it even across 1,000 years. The land was rich beyond anything the Greenlanders had ever seen. The rivers were full of salmon, bigger salmon than they had ever encountered. The grass was thick and green and did not wither in winter the way it did in Greenland. The days were longer than in Greenland or Iceland, which tells us something about the latitude. And there were vines growing wild, loaded with grapes, or at least with some kind of berry that the Norse identified as grapes, which is how the land got its name, Vinland, the land of wine, the land of vines. There has been endless scholarly debate about whether the vines were actually grapevines, which would place Vinland much further south than Newfoundland, or whether the Norse were referring to some other berry, perhaps wild currants or gooseberries, which grow abundantly in Newfoundland and Labrador. The debate matters because it affects where we think Vinland was, but for tonight what matters is the emotional reality of the discovery. Imagine being one of those 35 men. You have spent your entire life in Greenland or Iceland, places where the growing season is 2 months long, where the landscape is rock and ice and thin grass, where trees are so rare they are treated as treasure, and now you are standing on a shore where the forest goes back as far as you can see, where the rivers are teeming with fish, where wild berries grow in such abundance that you can fill a boat with them in an afternoon, where the grass is green and thick and the air is warm and the winter when it comes is milder than anything you have ever experienced. This is what Vinland looked like to the Norse. It was not just new land, it was paradise. It was everything that Greenland was not. It was the answer to every hardship, every hunger, every freezing winter night that these people had endured on the edge of the Arctic. Leif and his crew built houses. The sagas describe them constructing large houses, plural, which suggests a settlement of some substance, not just a single temporary shelter. They spent the winter in Vinland, and the saga notes with evident satisfaction that the frost barely came, the grass hardly withered, and the days were much more equal in length than in Greenland, meaning the sun did not disappear for months the way it did at higher latitudes. In the spring, Leif loaded his ship with timber and what the sagas call grapes, which may have been dried berries or even dried currants, and he sailed back to Greenland. The return voyage was eventful. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Leif rescued a group of shipwrecked Norse sailors on the way home, hauling them out of the ocean where they were clinging to the wreckage of their ship, which had broken apart on a reef. This act of seamanship and compassion earned him the nickname Leif the Lucky, which stuck for the rest of his life and is the name by which he is most commonly known in the sagas. The timber he brought back from Vinland was enormously valuable in treeless Greenland, and the story of the Greenland to the south with its abundant resources fired the imagination of the colony. Leif himself, however, never returned to Vinland. The sagas do not explain why. Perhaps his responsibilities as the leading man in the Greenland colony after his father Erik's death kept him at home. Perhaps he considered the discovery complete and saw no need to go back himself. Perhaps he understood, in a way that his brother Thorvald and his brother-in-law Thorfinn would learn through bitter experience, that the land to the south was not safe. Whatever the reason, Leif spent the rest of his life in Greenland, at the family homestead of Brattahlid, and he seems to have maintained ownership of Leifsputter, the camp in Vinland, lending it to subsequent expeditions but never selling it, and never returning himself. He disappears from the sagas after the Vinland period, which is how the sagas work. They tell you about the interesting parts of a person's life and leave the quiet parts to your imagination. Leif Erikson lived and died in Greenland, and he was buried somewhere in the colony and nobody knows where. But he had opened a door and others would walk through it. The next expedition to Vinland was led by Leif's brother Thorvald, who sailed with a crew of 30 men and spent 2 summers and a winter at Leif's camp, which had been left standing and was now referred to as Leifsputter, Leif's booths or Leif's camp. Thorvald and his men explored the coastline extensively, and the sagas describe them finding beautiful landscapes, deep forests, white sand beaches, and abundant wildlife. They found no signs of human habitation until one day, on a headland somewhere along the coast, they discovered 3 skin boats, each covering 3 men. These were the Scraelings, the Norse word for the indigenous people of North America, and this was the first documented encounter between Europeans and Native Americans in the history of the world. It did not go well. The Norse attacked the sleeping men beneath the boats, killing 8 of them. 1 escaped, and shortly afterward, a large group of Scraelings appeared in skin boats and attacked the Norse with arrows. Thorvald was struck by an arrow that lodged under his arm, and he died of the wound. His men buried him on the headland where he had wanted to build a homestead, marking the grave with crosses at his head and feet, and they spent the rest of the winter at Leifsputter before sailing back to Greenland with the news. This is the first recorded European death in the Americas, and it happened because of violence initiated by the Europeans themselves. Thorvald's expedition attacked sleeping men for no reason the sagas bother to explain, and the retaliation cost him his life. It is a pattern that would repeat itself across 5 centuries of European contact with the Americas, a cycle of unprovoked aggression followed by resistance followed by more aggression, but here, in the very first encounter, the indigenous people fought back effectively enough to kill the expedition leader and discourage further settlement. The most ambitious attempt to colonize Vinland came a few years later, led by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant of considerable wealth and status who had married Gudrid Thorbjornsdottir, one of the most fascinating women in the sagas. A woman who had been married 3 times, had travelled from Iceland to Greenland to Vinland, and eventually to Rome on a pilgrimage, and who is described in the sagas with a respect and prominence that tells you something about the role of women in Norse society that the popular Viking stereotype completely misses. Gudrid herself deserves a moment, because her story is remarkable even by saga standards. She was born in Iceland, emigrated to Greenland with her family, was widowed twice before marrying Thorfinn, travelled to Vinland and gave birth to the first European child born in North America, returned to Greenland, then to Iceland, then to Norway, and eventually made a pilgrimage to Rome, walking across medieval Europe to the seat of the Pope and back, before returning to Iceland and entering a convent in her old age. She is one of the most travelled women of the medieval world, a woman who crossed the Atlantic multiple times, who walked in the streets of Rome and slept in a turf longhouse in Newfoundland, who gave birth on an unknown shore and buried a husband in a new land, and whose life story spans the entire Norse world from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Western Hemisphere. The sagas give her more narrative attention than almost any other woman in Norse literature, which tells you something important about the culture that produced these stories. Norse women were not invisible, they held property. They could initiate divorce. They managed the household economy, which in a subsistence farming society meant they controlled the food supply, the textile production, and the daily survival of the family. A Norse farm wife was not subordinate to her husband in the way that women in many other medieval societies were. She was his partner, his co-manager, and in many practical matters, his equal. The decision to bring women to Vinland was not incidental, it was essential. Without women, there could be no colony. Without women spinning thread and weaving cloth and preserving food and managing the household, the settlement could not function for more than a single season. Thorfinn organised what was clearly intended to be a permanent colony. He brought 60 men and 5 women, along with livestock including cattle, which you do not bring on a dangerous ocean voyage unless you intend to stay. They sailed to Vinland, found Leifsbuthir, and settled in for the long term. The first winter went well, and the sagas linger on the details of this winter, with a warmth that tells you how remarkable it felt to people accustomed to the grinding cold of Greenland and Iceland. The livestock grazed on the abundant grass that stayed green longer into the autumn than anything the Norse had seen in their home countries. The cattle fattened. The sheep grew thick fleeces. The fishing was excellent, with cod and halibut and the enormous Vinland salmon that the sagas keep mentioning, salmon so large that the Greenlanders were astonished by them. The hunting was good too. The forests around the camp were full of game, deer and hare and birds in such abundance that the Norse could supplement their diet easily, a luxury that was unimaginable in the barren landscape of Greenland. There was driftwood on every beach, more timber lying on the sand than the Greenlanders would see in 10 years at home, and the weather was the greatest luxury of all. The winter was mild, the days were longer, the frost was light, the bay did not freeze over. A Norse farmer from Greenland who spent a winter in Vinland would have felt as if he had stumbled into a different world, a gentler world, a world where the land did not try to kill you every day from October to May. And Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, who was the first European child known to have been born in North America, over 500 years before Virginia Dare, who was usually given that distinction in American history books. In the spring, the Scraelings appeared. This time the encounter began peacefully. The indigenous people came to trade, bringing animal furs and skins, and the Norse traded milk and red cloth in return. The sagas describe the Scraelings as fascinated by the red cloth, cutting it into strips and tying it around their heads, and they describe the Norse as fascinated by the furs, which were of a quality and variety they had never seen before. It was a genuine exchange, a moment of mutual curiosity and cautious commerce between two peoples who had never seen anything like each other before. Think about what this moment must have felt like from both sides. The Norse standing on a beach in a land they considered uninhabited, watching a group of people emerge from the forest in skin boats, wearing clothing made of materials the Norse did not recognize, speaking a language that was completely unintelligible, carrying goods that were unlike anything in the Norse world. And the Scraelings, watching a group of people who had appeared from across the ocean in a wooden ship larger than any boat they had ever seen, wearing metal armour and carrying metal weapons, accompanied by animals, cattle, that the Scraelings had never encountered before. The sagas record that when one of the Norse bulls broke loose from its pen and charged bellowing toward the Scraelings, they were terrified and fled into the forest. They had never seen such an animal. Think about this from the Scraeling perspective. You have come to trade with these pale strangers who have appeared from across the ocean. The trading is going well. The red cloth they offer is beautiful, and they seem to want your furs, which you have in abundance. And then suddenly a massive animal that you have never seen before, a creature weighing over 1,000 pounds with horns and hooves, breaks free and charges directly at you, bellowing in a voice louder than anything in the northern forest. You have no framework for understanding what this animal is. Is it a pet? Is it a weapon? Is it a spirit? Is it dangerous? The only rational response is to run, and they ran. They came back 3 weeks later to trade again, which tells you something about their courage and their desire for the red cloth. But the incident must have deepened their suspicion of these strangers and their strange animals and their inexplicable customs. The two groups were as alien to each other as if they had come from different planets. The Norse had cattle and iron and wool and sailing ships. The Scraelings had birch-bark canoes and stone tools and fur clothing, and a 10,000-year-old knowledge of this land that the Norse could not begin to comprehend. Each group possessed technologies and knowledge that the other lacked, and under different circumstances this complementarity could have been the foundation of a mutually beneficial relationship. Instead, it became a source of fear and misunderstanding that escalated inevitably into violence. But the trading relationship did not last. The sagas are somewhat vague about what went wrong, but violence erupted again, this time on a much larger scale. The Scraelings attacked the settlement in force, and a pitched battle ensued. The Norse held their ground, but Thorfinn concluded that the colony was not sustainable. The Scraelings were too numerous, too hostile, and the Norse were too few and too far from reinforcement. After 3 years, Thorfinn packed up his colony, loaded his ships with timber and furs and his infant son, and sailed back to Greenland. He never returned to Vinland. Nobody did. Well, almost nobody. There's one more Vinland expedition that the sagas record, and it is perhaps the strangest of all. Leif's half-sister Freydis organised a voyage to Vinland with 2 Icelandic brothers named Helgi and Finnbogi, and the expedition ended in catastrophe. The sagas describe Freydis as a fierce and ruthless woman who instigated a massacre of the Icelandic brothers and their men, and then personally killed several women with an axe when the Norsemen in her party refused to do it. Whether this story is literally true, or whether Freydis has been turned into a villain by saga authors writing 2 centuries later, is impossible to know. But the story's presence in the saga tradition suggests that the Vinland ventures were not always the heroic explorations of popular imagination. They were also messy, contentious, violent affairs in which personal feuds and power struggles could turn deadly, far from any law or authority that might have restrained them. The Freydis episode left such a stain on the Vinland venture that it may have contributed to the decision to abandon further colonization attempts. After Freydis, nobody went back, or rather, nobody established another permanent settlement. There were probably occasional voyages to the Labrador coast for timber, and there is a reference in Icelandic records to a bishop of Greenland named Erik Knupsson, who sailed to Vinland in 1121 AD and was never heard from again, which is either a tragic footnote or a tantalizing clue depending on how you read it. But the grand experiment of Norse colonization in North America was over. It had lasted roughly 15 years, and now I want you to pause and sit with that fact for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the most baffling things in the entire history of human exploration. The Norse found a land that was richer, warmer, more fertile, and more abundant in every resource they needed than anything they had at home. They found timber in a world that was starving for timber. They found grassland in a world of ice. They found rivers full of fish and forests full of game, and a climate that was mild compared to the frozen hellscape of Greenland. And they walked away. They packed up their tools and their livestock and their children, and they sailed back to Greenland, back to the ice and the short summers and the long dark winters, and they never went back. Why? This is the question that has fascinated historians for over a century, and there is no single simple answer. Let me walk you through the factors, one by one, slowly, because they are interesting, and because they tell you something, not just about the Norse, but about the nature of exploration itself, and why some discoveries change the world and some disappear into silence. The first and most obvious factor is the Scraelings, the indigenous people of North America, whoever they were. The sagas do not give us enough detail to identify them with certainty, but they were probably the ancestors of the Beothuk, the Innu, the Mi'kmaq, or possibly the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo people. Made it clear that the Norse were not welcome. Every attempt at sustained contact ended in violence, and the Norse were simply too few to fight an ongoing war against a local population that vastly outnumbered them. This is a crucial difference between the Norse discovery and the later Spanish, English, and French colonizations. When Columbus arrived in 1492, he was backed by the resources of a nation-state. He could call for reinforcements, supplies, weapons, and settlers from Spain. When Cortés invaded Mexico, he had 600 men, but he also had steel armor, crossbows, cannons, horses, and most importantly, the diseases that would do most of his killing for him. The Norse had none of these advantages. They had no nation-state backing them. They had no gunpowder, no horses, no epidemic diseases to clear the land ahead of them. They were a few dozen people from a colony of a few thousand, operating at the absolute limit of their logistical reach, and they were facing indigenous populations that were well-armed, well-organized, and perfectly adapted to the local environment in ways the Norse were not. The military equation was simple. The Norse could not hold Vinland by force, and the Scraelings would not let them hold it by permission. The second factor is distance. Look at a map. Vinland, at the northern tip of Newfoundland, is roughly 1,000 nautical miles from the Greenland settlements. 1,000 miles of open North Atlantic, some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, with icebergs, fog, storms and currents that can push a ship hundreds of miles off course. The voyage took 2 to 3 weeks in good conditions, longer in bad, and there was no guarantee of good conditions. Every trip to Vinland was a gamble with the lives of everyone aboard, and every year that the colony existed it needed supplies, reinforcements, and trade goods that had to cross that 1,000 miles of lethal ocean. The Greenland colony itself was already at the extreme edge of the Norse world's logistical capability. Vinland was a bridge too far. The third factor is demographics. The entire Greenland colony had perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people at its peak. That is not a large population base from which to launch a colonial venture 1,000 miles away, across hostile waters against a hostile indigenous population. The Greenland Norse simply did not have enough people. They could not spare the settlers, the ships, the livestock, or the supplies needed to establish and maintain a permanent colony in Vinland without fatally weakening the home colony. Every family that moved to Vinland was a family that was not farming in Greenland, not producing the food and wool and dairy products that kept the colony alive. It was a zero-sum equation, and Greenland could not afford to lose. The fourth factor is economic. What did Vinland offer that was worth the enormous risk and expense of maintaining a colony there? Timber, certainly, and that was valuable. Furs, fish, wild berries, grassland. But all of these things, except perhaps the timber, were also available in Greenland or could be obtained through trade with Norway and Iceland at less risk. The Greenland Norse already had fishing. They already had grassland, limited as it was. They already had furs from hunting Arctic fox and polar bear and walrus. The one resource that Vinland offered that Greenland desperately needed was timber, and it may be that occasional logging expeditions to the Labrador coast, Markland, continued for decades or even centuries after the Vinland settlements were abandoned. There are Icelandic records mentioning a ship arriving from Markland as late as 1347 AD, which is an extraordinary and underappreciated fact. 350 years after Leif Erikson's first voyage, Norse sailors were still crossing the Atlantic to the coast of Labrador to harvest timber. The 1347 entry in the Icelandic annals is terse, as such entries tend to be. It simply records that a small ship with a crew of 17 or 18 men arrived in Iceland from Markland, having been driven off course from their intended destination of Greenland. The ship had no anchor, which suggests a rough voyage or a hasty departure. But the entry's very ordinariness is what makes it so significant. The annalist does not describe the Markland voyage as unusual or remarkable. He records it the way he would record any other arrival, as a routine event. This suggests that Norse voyages to the Labrador coast for timber were common enough in the 14th century to be unremarkable, part of the regular economic activity of the Greenland colony, a 300-year-old supply route that had been operating since Leif Erikson's time. If this is true, then the Norse presence in North American waters was not a brief 15-year episode in the early 11th century. It was a sustained, centuries-long relationship with the North American coast, a relationship that has left almost no archaeological trace, because timber harvesting crews do not build permanent structures or leave behind significant artifacts. They sail in, cut trees, load their ship, and sail home. The 1347 record is probably the last glimpse we have of this centuries-long Norse connection to North America, a connection that would end when the Greenland colony itself collapsed a few decades later. But a logging expedition is very different from a colony. You sail in, cut trees, load your ship, and sail home. You do not need to defend a permanent settlement against a hostile population. You do not need to bring women and children and livestock. You do not need to stay through the winter. The economics of occasional timber harvesting worked. The economics of permanent colonization did not. The fifth factor, and this is the one that I find most haunting, is knowledge, or rather, the lack of it. The Norse had no idea what they had found. They knew they had found a large land with trees and fish and grass and berries. They did not know they had found a continent. They did not know that the coastline they had explored was the eastern edge of a landmass that stretched 5,000 miles to the Pacific Ocean. containing every climate zone from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, every type of terrain from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Plains to the Mississippi Delta, and tens of millions of people living in civilizations that range from the mound-building cities of Cahokia to the pueblo complexes of the southwest to the fishing empires of the Pacific Northwest. The Norse thought they had found a large island, or perhaps a peninsula of some greater landmass. They had no framework for understanding the scale of their discovery because the concept of a Western Hemisphere, two entire continents unknown to the Old World, was so far outside the medieval European worldview that it was literally unthinkable. Columbus, 5 centuries later, would make the same mistake. He went to his grave believing he had reached the outer islands of Asia. The idea that there could be an entirely separate landmass between Europe and Asia, unknown to the Greeks and Romans and Arabs and Chinese, was simply too big for the medieval mind to process. The Norse had the same problem, compounded by the fact that they did not have the theoretical geography that Columbus would later draw on. Flawed as it was, they did not even know what questions to ask. They found a coastline, it had trees, it had hostile people, it was very far away, they went home, and the sixth factor, which I have not mentioned yet because it is the most subtle and perhaps the most important, is timing. The Norse discovered America at exactly the wrong moment. The Norse world in 1000 AD was in the middle of a profound transformation. The old decentralized society of independent chieftains and free farmers was giving way to centralized royal power. Christianity was replacing the old Norse religion. The Viking Age, with its emphasis on exploration, raiding, and individual enterprise, was ending. The era of nation-states, feudal hierarchies, and institutional Christianity was beginning. In this new world, individual expeditions to unknown lands on the far side of the ocean were not a priority. The kings of Norway and Denmark were consolidating their power at home, fighting each other and their own nobles, building churches and establishing bishoprics, and integrating their kingdoms into the wider European political and economic system. They had no interest in funding colonies on the far side of the Atlantic, when they could barely control their own territory. And the Greenland colony, which was the only possible base for Vinland operations, was too small, too poor, and too isolated to sustain the venture on its own. The Norse discovered America too early. They discovered it before Europe had the political organization, the economic motivation, the technological capability, and the ideological framework to exploit the discovery. When Europe finally did develop all of those things, in the late 1400s, it was the Spanish and Portuguese who led the way, not the Scandinavians, and they did it with resources and technologies that the Norse of 1000 AD could not have imagined. Cannons, gunpowder, astrolabes, magnetic compasses, printing presses that could disseminate the news of discovery across a continent in months, nation-states that could fund and sustain colonial ventures for decades, and diseases, the invisible army that would do more to conquer the Americas than all the swords and guns in Europe combined. The Norse had none of this. They had courage, skill, determination, and some of the finest ships the world had ever seen. And it was not enough. And now I want to take you to the place itself, because in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad, an archaeologist, did something that changed the history of the Americas forever. They found the evidence. Let me tell you a little more about the sagas themselves, because they are central to this story, and they deserve to be understood on their own terms. The Icelandic sagas are one of the great literary achievements of the Middle Ages, a body of prose narrative written in Old Norse between roughly 1200 and 1400 AD that tells the stories of the Norse settlement of Iceland, the discovery of Greenland and Vinland, and the lives and feuds and adventures of the Icelandic chieftains and their families. They are written in a style that is terse, understated, and almost eerily modern, with a dry wit and a refusal to editorialize that makes them read more like journalism than mythology. The saga authors do not tell you what their characters are feeling. They tell you what their characters did and said, and they leave you to draw your own conclusions. This literary restraint gives the sagas a power and a credibility that more florid medieval narratives lack. When the saga of the Greenlanders tells you that Bjarni Herjolfsson saw a forested coast and decided not to go ashore, it does not explain his reasoning or judge his decision. It simply states what happened. This flatness of tone is precisely what makes the saga accounts of Vinland believable. They do not sound like myths, they sound like reports. The two main sources for the Vinland story, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red, were written down roughly 200 years after the events they describe, which means they are based on oral tradition rather than eyewitness accounts. This gap has led some scholars to treat them with deep skepticism, and for centuries the saga accounts of Vinland had been treated by most historians as mythology, or at best as wildly exaggerated travellers' tales. Scholars argued endlessly about whether the Norse had actually reached North America, and if so, where Vinland might have been. Locations were proposed all the way from Hudson Bay to Virginia to Florida, with little agreement and less evidence. The sagas were considered unreliable, and without archaeological confirmation, the Norse discovery of America remained in the same category as King Arthur and El Dorado, a nice story that was probably not true. Helge Ingstad refused to accept this. He was not an academic. He was an adventurer, a man who had spent years living with indigenous peoples in the Canadian Arctic, and who had an instinct for landscape and geography that no amount of library research could replicate. He began by reading the sagas with fresh eyes, not as literature but as sailing directions, and he plotted the courses described in the texts against the actual geography and prevailing winds and currents of the North Atlantic. His analysis led him to the northern tip of Newfoundland, to a place called Meadows, a small fishing village on the shore of a shallow bay, where a grassy terrace overlooked the water and a small brook ran down to the beach. Local fishermen told Ingstad about some old ruins on the terrace that they had always assumed were the remains of an old indigenous camp. Ingstad looked at the ruins and immediately recognized something that no one else had seen. The outlines in the grass were not round, the way indigenous structures in this region would be. They were rectangular. They were Norse. Anne Stein-Ingstad led the excavation over the course of 8 field seasons between 1961 and 1968, and what she uncovered was extraordinary. There were at least 8 structures, including 3 large halls that were clearly Norse longhouses built in the Icelandic and Greenlandic style, with turf walls over a wooden frame, a central hearth, and internal room divisions. There was a small structure that had been used as a forge, with a stone anvil and iron slag and bog iron that had been smelted on site. This was critical evidence because the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland in this period did not work iron. Iron smelting was a distinctly European technology, and its presence at Meadows was proof that Europeans had been here. There was a small building that appeared to have been a carpentry workshop, and there was evidence of boat repair, including iron boat nails and a stone-lined pit that may have been used for producing tar to caulk ship hulls. The artifacts were few but definitive. A bronze cloak pin of a type common in Norse settlements, a bone needle, a stone oil lamp of Norse design, iron rivets, and most evocatively a small spindle whorl, a disc of soapstone used in spinning thread, which told the archaeologists that women had been present at the settlement. This was not a temporary hunting camp. This was a place where people lived and worked and made things, where men forged iron and repaired boats, and women spun thread and sewed clothing. Radiocarbon dating placed the occupation at around 1000 AD, exactly when the sagas said the Vinland voyages took place. The evidence was overwhelming. The Norse had been here. The sagas were true. Meadows was not necessarily the Vinland of the sagas. In fact, it was almost certainly not the place where Leif found the famous grapes or vines, because wild grapes do not grow in Newfoundland. The site is more likely Leifsbutir, the base camp from which the Norse launched expeditions further south along the coast, or possibly a way station used during voyages between Greenland and more southerly destinations. There is evidence in the artifacts that the Norse at Meadows had contact with lands further south. Butternuts and butternut wood were found at the site, and butternuts do not grow north of New Brunswick, which means someone from Meadows travelled at least that far south and brought them back. The implication is tantalising. The Norse did not just visit the tip of Newfoundland. They explored further. They sailed south along the coast, into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps into the Bay of Fundy, perhaps as far as New England. The full extent of Norse exploration in North America remains unknown, and it is possible that it was far more extensive than the handful of saga accounts suggest. In 2012, archaeologist Patricia Sutherland announced evidence of possible Norse contact at several sites on Baffin Island and in northern Labrador, including yarns spun from the fur of animals not native to the Arctic which may have been Norse in origin. The evidence is controversial and not universally accepted, but it suggests that the Norse may have had a more extensive and more prolonged presence in the North American Arctic than the saga accounts alone would indicate. There are also the tantalizing Norse artifacts found far from any known Norse site. A Norwegian coin from the reign of Olaf Kyrre, dated to between 1065 and 1080 AD, was found at an indigenous site in Maine called the Goddard site. The coin had been pierced for use as a pendant, which means it was probably acquired by indigenous people through trade rather than directly from Norse visitors, but it is physical evidence that Norse objects were circulating in the indigenous trade networks of eastern North America decades after the Vinland settlements were abandoned. How far south did the Norse actually go? The sagas describe Vinland as a place where wild vines grew, and where the winter was mild and the days were notably longer than in Greenland. If we take the vine references literally as meaning actual grapevines, then the Norse must have reached at least the southern coast of New Brunswick, or possibly Nova Scotia, where wild grapes grow today. Some scholars have proposed locations as far south as Cape Cod or even Long Island Sound. The truth is that we do not know, and we may never know, because the Norse left almost no physical trace of their presence south of Meadows, and the indigenous peoples they encountered left no written records of the contact. The Norse exploration of North America is like an iceberg. We can see the tip, Meadows, confirmed and excavated and studied for decades. But beneath the surface, invisible and perhaps inaccessible, lies an unknown volume of exploration, contact and experience that the saga authors either did not know about or chose not to record. Now let me tell you what the land actually looked like when the Norse stepped ashore, because this is the part of the story that connects tonight's episode to everything we have been talking about on this channel, the pre-American world, the world that was here before ours. When Leif Erikson's ship rounded the northern tip of Newfoundland and entered the shallow bay where Meadows would later be built, he was entering a world that had been inhabited by human beings for thousands of years. The first peoples had arrived in Newfoundland and Labrador at least 9,000 years ago, following the retreating glaciers northward as the last ice age ended. By 1000 AD, the indigenous landscape of the region was complex and layered with thousands of years of human history. The immediate area around Meadows was likely inhabited or frequented by the ancestors of the Beothuk people, the indigenous nation of Newfoundland who would later be driven to extinction by European colonization in the early 1800s, one of the most complete and most tragic genocides in the history of the Americas. The Beothuk were a maritime people who lived primarily along the coast in summer, hunting seals and seabirds and fishing for salmon and cod, and moved inland in winter to hunt caribou in the vast boreal forests of the interior. They travelled in elegant birch bark canoes with distinctively high, curved sides that were designed for coastal waters, and they painted their bodies and their belongings with red ochre, a practice that may be the origin of the term Red Indians, a name that was later applied indiscriminately to all indigenous peoples of the Americas. The Beothuk were not numerous, perhaps a few thousand people at most, but they had been living on this island for centuries, and they knew every inlet, every river, every caribou trail, every salmon run. They were also not the only indigenous people in the region. To the north, on the Labrador coast and in the Arctic, the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo people, an ancient Arctic culture that had existed for nearly 2,000 years, were in the final centuries of their existence. They would soon be replaced or absorbed by the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who were expanding eastward from Alaska and would reach Greenland within a few centuries. And to the south, along the coasts of what are now the maritime provinces and New England, other Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Micmac, the Maliseet, the Passamaquoddy, the Abenaki, were living in communities that had been established for thousands of years, fishing the rich waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Bay of Fundy, hunting in the forests, farming where the climate permitted, and maintaining trade networks that connected communities hundreds of miles apart. This is the world the Norse walked into. It was not empty. It was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a landscape with a deep human history, a landscape where every bay and river and headland had a name, in a language the Norse could not understand, where every fishing ground had been fished for generations, where every trail had been walked by thousands of feet before theirs. The Norse did not discover an empty land. They discovered a land that was already someone else's home. And the people who lived there looked at these pale strangers with their metal tools and their wooden ships and their bellowing cattle, and they made a judgment. They decided that these strangers were not welcome, and in the end that judgment held. The strangers left. Now I want to take you through a day at Meadows as it might have been experienced by one of those Norse settlers, because the archaeology tells us enough to reconstruct the daily rhythms of life at this place, and because there is something deeply calming about imagining the ordinary details of a life lived 1,000 years ago on a shore that looks very much the same today as it did then. You wake up in a Norse longhouse. The air inside is warm and smoky, heated by a long central hearth that runs the length of the building, a line of low fire-burning peat and driftwood, the smoke rising to the turf and timber roof and filtering slowly out through gaps in the ridge. The walls are thick, built of stacked turf blocks faced with a stone in a wall, and they hold the heat with remarkable efficiency. The floor is packed earth, covered in places with woven grass mats. Your bed is a wooden platform along the wall, raised above the floor to escape the cold that seeps up from the ground, and it is covered with layers of animal hide, sheepskin and sealskin, and perhaps caribou hide traded or taken from the Scraelings. The light is dim. There are no windows in a Norse turf house, or if there are, they are small and covered with stretched animal membrane that lets in light but not wind. The only real light comes from the hearth, and from small soapstone oil lamps burning seal oil or whale oil, which give off a warm yellowish glow and a faintly fishy smell. You sit up and look down the length of the longhouse. It is perhaps 60 to 70 feet long, and perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide, a single long room divided into sections by low wooden partitions. Other people are stirring. You can hear someone adding fuel to the hearth. You can hear the faint sound of wind outside, because there is always wind on the northern coast of Newfoundland. A steady Atlantic wind that smells of salt and fog and the vast cold ocean that separates you from everything you have ever known. You dress. Your clothing is wool, woven from the fleece of sheep that your people brought from Greenland on the ship, sheep that are now grazing in the meadow outside, fattening on grass that is richer than any grass in Greenland. You pull on a wool tunic that reaches past your knees, belted at the waist. You pull on wool trousers. You pull on leather shoes, soft-soled, made from cowhide. If it is cold, you wrap yourself in a heavy wool cloak fastened at the shoulder with a bronze pin, the kind of pin that Anne Stein Ingstad would find in the soil 1,000 years from now and hold up to the light as proof that your people were here. Outside, if you step through the low doorway, you emerge into the Newfoundland morning. The air hits you immediately, cold and salt-sharp, carrying the smell of the ocean and the faint vegetal sweetness of the bog. The meadow slopes gently down to the bay, and the grass is wet with dew or fog, because there is almost always fog on the northern tip of Newfoundland, a soft grey presence that rolls in from the Labrador current and sits over the land like a blanket, muffling sound and blurring the edges of everything. On a clear morning, which happens perhaps one day in 3, the bay is a sheet of hammered silver, and you can see the dark line of the Labrador coast across the Strait of Belle Isle, impossibly distant, the place you stopped for timber on your way here. The other longhouses are visible, their turf roofs blending with the meadow so completely that from a distance they look like natural features of the landscape, low humps in the grass, and only the smoke rising from the ridge vents tells you they are occupied. The ship is pulled up on the beach, leaning on its keel, its hull dark with tar, and the sight of it is both comforting and frightening, because it is your only way home, and if anything happens to it, you are stranded on this shore forever. You eat breakfast. The Norse diet at Meadows was probably similar to the diet in Greenland, heavy on animal protein, with dried or salted fish, dairy products if the cattle are producing, and perhaps bread or porridge made from grain brought from Greenland, though grain would have been a luxury this far from the home colony. You might eat dried cod or dried seal meat. You might eat skyr, the thick yogurt-like dairy product that the Norse have been making for centuries and that is still made in Iceland today. You might eat berries, the wild currants and gooseberries and bake apples that grow abundantly in the meadows around the settlement, the berries that Leif may have called grapes when he named this land Vinland. After breakfast, the day's work begins, and it would have varied depending on the season and the needs of the settlement. In summer, some men would be fishing, setting nets in the bay, or sailing to the outer islands where cod and seabirds were abundant. Others would be cutting timber in the forest that began just a few hundred yards from the settlement, felling trees and splitting them into planks for construction and ship repair. The carpenter would be working in his workshop, shaping timbers for a new building or repairing the hull of a boat. The blacksmith would be working in his forge, smelting bog iron in a small furnace heated with charcoal, hammering the bloom of raw iron into nails and rivets and tools on his stone anvil. Bog iron smelting is a laborious process. First you have to find the iron-rich bog deposits, which look like a reddish-brown sediment in the muck at the edges of ponds and streams. Then you have to collect this sediment and dry it. Then you have to build a small clay furnace, fill it with layers of charcoal and iron ore, and keep it burning at high temperature for hours, pumping air into the fire with bellows until the iron separates from the slag and collects at the bottom of the furnace as a spongy mass called a bloom. The bloom then has to be hammered repeatedly to squeeze out the remaining slag and consolidate the metal into usable iron. The whole process, from collecting bog ore to producing a handful of iron nails, takes days of hard work, and the fact that the Norse were doing it at Meadows tells us two things. First, they intended to stay long enough to justify the effort, and second, they understood that they could not rely on imports for something as essential as iron. They had to be self-sufficient. The women would be working too. The spindle whorl found at Meadows tells us that women were spinning thread, probably from wool, which means they were also likely weaving cloth. Cloth production was one of the most important and most time-consuming activities in any Norse household. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every sail started as raw fleece that had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread on a hand spindle, and then woven on an upright loom. A single sail for a Norse ship required roughly 250 square feet of densely woven wool, which represented hundreds of hours of spinning and weaving. The women at Meadows were not idle bystanders. They were essential workers whose labour made the settlement viable. In the afternoon, if the weather is calm, you might walk down to the brook that runs past the settlement and check the fishing nets. The brook is small, barely wide enough to jump across, but in autumn it fills with salmon heading upstream to spawn, and the Norse would have set nets or built simple weirs to catch them. Salmon was a staple food in both Iceland and Greenland, and the sagas specifically mention that the salmon in Vinland were larger than any the Norse had seen before, which is consistent with the Atlantic salmon of Newfoundland, which are indeed among the largest in the species range. You might gather bog iron from the edges of the ponds. You might collect firewood from the driftwood that washes up on the beach, great twisted logs of spruce and fir that have been carried south by the Labrador current from the forests of the north, bleached white by salt and sun, hard and dry and perfect for burning. You might simply stand on the grassy terrace above the bay and look out at the water and think about the strangeness of where you are. This is one of those moments I want you to settle into. It is late afternoon. The wind has died down. The bay is calm, reflecting the grey sky. The grass around you is green, studded with wild flowers, gentler than any landscape in Greenland. Behind you, the forest stands dark and silent, spruce and fir trees growing so close together that you cannot see more than a few yards into the woods. You do not know what is in that forest. You do not know how far it extends. You do not know if anyone is watching you from the shadows between the trees. You know only that you are standing on the edge of the world, on a shore that no one in Europe knows about, in a land that has no name in any language you speak, and that the ocean behind you is cold and wide and the only road home. The light is starting to fade. It fades earlier here than it does in Greenland in midsummer, which means you are further south, but it still fades in that long, slow, northern way that gives you an hour of twilight before the darkness comes. You can hear the sound of the brook. You can hear a raven somewhere in the forest, its call harsh and familiar, because ravens are the same in Newfoundland as they are in Norway, the same black shape, the same rough voice, one of the few things in this strange land that sounds like home. In the evening you return to the longhouse. The hearth has been built up and the fire is burning brighter now, casting flickering shadows on the turf walls. Someone has cooked a meal, fish probably, roasted over the coals or boiled in a soapstone pot, with berries and perhaps some dried grain from the ship's stores. You eat sitting on the bench along the wall, the wooden platform that serves as both seating and sleeping surface. The conversation is quiet. People are tired from the day's work. Someone might be mending a fishing net. Someone might be sharpening a knife on a whetstone. Someone might be telling a story, because storytelling is the central entertainment of Norse culture. The way they pass the long evenings, the way they preserve their history and their identity, the way they make sense of who they are and where they came from and what they are doing in this strange Greenland at the edge of everything. The stories they tell are the sagas, though they are not called that yet. They are simply the stories, told and retold from memory, passed from one teller to the next across generations, and they will not be written down for another 200 years, when Icelandic scribes will finally commit them to parchment and create some of the greatest literature of the medieval world. But tonight, in this longhouse on the coast of Newfoundland in the year 1000 AD, the stories are spoken aloud by firelight, and the listeners lean in, and the wind presses against the turf walls outside, and the sound of the ocean is always there, just at the edge of hearing, the constant reminder that the world you came from is very far away. And there are other people listening too, though you do not know it. Somewhere in the forest, or along the coast in either direction, the Beothuk are watching. They have seen your ship, they have seen your smoke, they have watched you cut trees and build houses and let strange animals loose on the grass. They know you are here. They have been talking about you among themselves, debating what to do about you, trying to understand who you are and where you came from, and why you are cutting down their trees and building houses on their land without asking permission. They have not decided what to do about you yet. They have seen strangers before. Their ancestors have been living on this island for thousands of years, and they have encountered other peoples, the Dorset people who lived here before them, the Inuit who are expanding southward from the Arctic, and perhaps other groups whose names are lost to history. They have a framework for dealing with strangers. They have experience. They have wisdom that has been accumulated over centuries of watching and waiting and making careful decisions about when to approach and when to retreat and when to fight. And they have something that the Norse do not have. They have patience. They can wait. They know this land. They know its rhythms. They know that the long winter is coming, and they know that these strangers with their loud animals and their heavy buildings and their pale skin do not know what the winter here can do. They know that the wind will test these strangers. They know that the ice will test them. They know that the darkness will test them. And they know that if they wait long enough, the land itself will make the decision for them. But they are watching. They are always watching. The fire in the longhouse burns low. The conversations fade. People stretch out on their sleeping platforms, pulling furs and blankets over themselves, and the only sounds are the crackle of the settling hearth, the breathing of 30 people in a long dark room, and the wind outside, always the wind carrying the smell of the ocean, and the vast unknown continent that stretches away to the west, a continent that you will never explore, that your people will never settle, that will remain unknown to Europe for another 500 years, waiting in the darkness like a secret that the world is not ready to hear. And this is the part of the story where I want to talk about what was lost. Not lost in the sense of tragedy, because the Norse did not lose Vinland the way you lose a battle or a war. They simply let it go. They set it down and walked away. They returned to their fjords and their sheep and their long winters, and within a few generations the whole adventure had faded from living memory into legend, from legend into saga, and from saga into skepticism, until most people assumed it had never happened at all. What was lost was the connection. For a brief moment, roughly 15 years between 1000 and 1015 AD, Europe and North America were connected. People crossed the ocean in both directions. Goods were exchanged, stories were told. A child was born, a man was buried. Iron was smelted from American bog ore on American soil. Thread was spun from wool on an American shore. For 15 years, the two hemispheres of the planet were aware of each other's existence, and then the door closed, and it stayed closed for 5 centuries, and when it opened again, it opened with a violence that would reshape both hemispheres forever. But it did not have to be that way. That is what makes the Norse story so compelling, so full of what-ifs, so rich with alternate possibility. What if the Norse had made peace with the Scraelings? What if they had traded instead of attacked? What if Thorvald had not killed those sleeping men beneath the skin boats? What if Thorfinn Karlsefni had stayed 1 more year, 2 more years, 10 more years? What if the Greenland colony had been larger, more prosperous, better able to support the Vinland venture? What if? What if? What if? History is full of what-ifs, but few are as tantalizing as this one, because the Norse were not abstract, they were not hypothetical, they were here. They left behind a forge and a spindle whorl and a bronze pin and charcoal from fires they built with their own hands. They ate butternuts they had gathered from trees that only grow hundreds of miles to the south, which means they explored far beyond Lonso Meadows, far beyond the northern tip of Newfoundland down into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, maybe into New Brunswick, maybe into Maine, They were curious, they were restless. They were doing what Norse people had always done, pushing the boundary one step further, one fjord deeper, one island farther west. And they stopped. They stopped not because the land was hostile, but because the math did not work, because the distance was too great and the people too few, and the continent too full of other peoples who had their own plans for this land. The Norse came so close. They had their hand on the door. They had stepped through it. They had tasted the berries and felled the trees and built the fires and slept under the American sky. And then they went home, and the door swung shut, and the continent went back to sleep. And when Europe finally returned, it returned with guns and germs and steel, and an ideology of conquest that would destroy the world the Norse had glimpsed. The Norse encounter with America was a road not taken, a gentler first contact that could have led to a very different history if different choices had been made. It is easy to romanticize this, and I want to be careful not to do that. The Norse were not gentle people. They attacked sleeping men on a beach. They kidnapped Scraelings and took them back to Greenland as curiosities. They were products of a violent age and they acted accordingly. But they also traded fairly when trade was possible. They brought women and children and livestock, which suggests they wanted to build, not just conquer. They left when it became clear they could not stay, rather than escalating the violence. And the total death toll of the Norse presence in North America on both sides was probably countable on two hands. Compare that to what came after. Compare that to the millions who died from disease, the civilizations that were destroyed, the languages that were silenced, the knowledge that was lost when the second wave of Europeans arrived 5 centuries later and treated the continent not as a place to be shared but as a prize to be taken. The Norse story is a reminder that contact between civilizations does not have to end in catastrophe. It can be tentative, cautious, limited, and ultimately reversible. The Norse proved that. They came, they saw, they decided it was not worth the trouble, and they went home. The world has never managed to be that restrained again. Let me bring you back to Lonso Meadows one more time, because I want you to see what the site looks like today, 1,000 years after the Norse abandoned it, because it is one of the most peaceful and most evocative places on Earth. The northern tip of Newfoundland is a place of enormous beauty and enormous emptiness. The land is low and rolling, covered with tough grass and wildflowers and patches of stunted spruce. The coastline is rocky, indented with shallow bays and coves, and the ocean stretches away to the north and east until it merges with the sky, in a line so flat and so far away that it seems like the edge of the world. On a clear day, you can see the coast of Labrador across the Strait of Belle Isle, a low dark line on the northern horizon, the same coast that the Norse called Markland, forest land. The ruins at Lonso Meadows are barely visible. They are shallow depressions in the grass, outlines of foundations and hearths and forge pits, the faintest traces of a settlement that was here for 15 years, 1,000 years ago. The turf walls have collapsed and been reabsorbed by the earth. The hearths are filled with soil and grass. If you did not know what you were looking at, you would walk right past them. But if you do know, if you stand on the grassy terrace and look at the outlines and let your imagination work, you can see it. You can see the longhouses. You can see the smoke rising from the hearths. You can see the ship drawn up on the beach below, its hull dark with tar, its wool sail furled on the yard. You can see people moving between the buildings, carrying wood, mending nets, tending the fire in the forge. You can see a woman sitting in a doorway, spinning thread on a hand spindle, the spindle whorl turning slowly, the thread growing longer between her fingers. You can see a man standing on the terrace where you're standing now, looking out at the same bay, the same ocean, the same flat line of Labrador on the horizon, wondering the same things you are wondering tonight. What is out there? What does it mean? What should we do about it? And you can see, at the edge of the forest, just where the trees begin, a flicker of movement, a shadow, a face, someone watching, someone who has been here much longer than you have, and who will be here long after you're gone. Lonso Meadows was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, the first cultural site in the world to receive that designation, in recognition of its significance as the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America and the earliest known European presence in the New World. A small museum stands near the ruins, and reconstructed Norse buildings have been built nearby, turf longhouses with central hearths and sleeping platforms, so that visitors can walk inside and stand in the dim, smoky interior and imagine what it felt like to live here on the edge of the world 1,000 years ago. It is a quiet place. Not many people visit. The nearest town is small. The road to get there is long and winds through empty landscape. The wind is constant. The light is extraordinary. That low northern light that makes everything look both sharper and softer at the same time. Every blade of grass distinct, every wave on the bay visible, every cloud defined against the pale sky. It is one of those places that makes you feel very small and very old and very connected to something that happened a long time ago, in a world that was not so different from yours. If you visit in late August, which is when the Norse would have first arrived 1,000 years ago, the wildflowers are at their peak. The meadow is dotted with purple iris and yellow buttercup and white daisies, and the grass is thick and green, and the brook runs clear over smooth stones on its way to the bay. Icebergs drift past in the strait, great white shapes that catch the light and glow against the dark blue water. The same icebergs that the Norse would have seen and navigated around on their approach. Whales surface in the strait, minky whales and humpbacks that blow plumes of mist into the still air, and the sound of their breathing carries across the water. Bald eagles circle on the updrafts above the headlands. Foxes trot across the meadow at dawn and dusk, red and quick and unafraid. And the ravens are still here. They're always here. They perch on the reconstruction buildings and on the fence posts and on the interpretive signs, watching the visitors with the same sharp intelligence that they watched the Norse 1,000 years ago. Ravens live a long time, and they remember faces, and they teach their young what they know, and there is probably an unbroken chain of raven knowledge on this terrace stretching back to the day the first Norse ship beached in the bay below. The ravens watch the Norse arrive. They watch them build. They watch them leave. They watch the grass grow over the ruins. And they are still watching, 1,000 years later, from the same trees, in the same wind, on the same shore. Let me tell you about Greenland now, because the end of the Greenland colony is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the medieval world, and it is connected to the Vinland story in ways that matter. The Greenland Norse colony survived for nearly 500 years, from Erik the Red's founding around 985 AD to its final disappearance sometime in the 1400s. At its peak, the colony had perhaps 5,000 people living in two main settlements, raising cattle and sheep, hunting seals and caribou and walrus, trading walrus ivory and polar bear furs with Europe through Norwegian merchant ships that made the dangerous crossing once or twice a year. The colony had churches and a cathedral and a bishop. It was part of the Christian world, paying tithes to Rome, following the liturgical calendar, baptizing its children and burying its dead in consecrated ground. It was European, and then it vanished. The archaeology of the final decades tells a story of slow constriction. The western settlement, which was always smaller and more exposed, seems to have been abandoned first, probably in the mid-1300s. Archaeological excavations of the last occupied farms in the western settlement found something that has haunted historians ever since. The bones of the colony's hunting dogs were found in the ruins, and the dogs had been butchered for food. The hooves of the last cattle were found, and they showed signs of severe malnutrition. The insect remains in the soil told a story of a final winter in which the barns were not cleaned, because there were not enough people left to do it, and the flies and beetles of accumulated manure flourished in the warming spring while the humans who had fed and sheltered those cattle were gone. Where they went, nobody knows. The eastern settlement lasted longer, perhaps another 50 or 60 years. The last known written record from the Greenland colony is a letter dated 1408, describing a wedding at Valsey Church in the eastern settlement. The church at Valsey still stands, or rather its stone walls still stand, the best preserved Norse ruin in Greenland. A small rectangular structure with thick stone walls and narrow window openings that look out over the fjord. People were married there. People were baptized there. People sang hymns there in a language that nobody on that continent speaks anymore. The wedding in 1408 is the last documented moment of Norse life in Greenland, the last time we can say with certainty that European civilization existed on the western side of the Atlantic. After that, silence. The ship stopped coming. The letters stopped. Europe lost contact with its westernmost colony, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about it. The colony simply dropped out of the European consciousness like a stone sinking into dark water, and when European explorers finally reached Greenland again in the 1700s, they found the settlements empty. The longhouses were in ruins, the churches were crumbling, the fields were overgrown, The livestock were gone, the people were gone, every single one. What happened to the Greenland Norse is still debated, and the answer probably involves a combination of factors. The climate was changing. The medieval warm period, which had made the Greenland settlements viable by providing just enough warmth for grass to grow and cattle to survive, was ending, replaced by the Little Ice Age, which brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and expanding sea ice that made the voyage to and from Europe increasingly dangerous and eventually impossible. The walrus ivory trade, which had been the colony's primary source of income and its main connection to the European economy, collapsed in the 1300s when cheaper elephant ivory from Africa flooded the European market. Without the ivory trade, the Norwegian merchant ships had no economic reason to make the long and dangerous voyage to Greenland, and without the merchant ships the colony lost its supply line to Europe, its source of iron, grain, and other essential goods that could not be produced locally. The Black Death, which killed roughly a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, devastated Norway's population and economy, further reducing the number of ships and sailors available for the Greenland trade. And the Inuit, the Thule people who had been expanding eastward across the Arctic for centuries, were moving into the areas around the Norse settlements, competing for the same marine mammal hunting grounds that the Norse depended on for food. The Inuit had technologies that the Norse lacked and apparently refused to adopt. The Inuit kayak, a closed-deck boat that could navigate ice-filled waters with extraordinary agility, was far better suited to Arctic marine hunting than the Norse open boat. The Inuit toggling harpoon, a sophisticated weapon designed to hold marine mammals rather than simply wound them, was more effective than Norse hunting weapons for taking seals and walrus. The Inuit wore clothing made from sealskin and caribou hide that was tailored to fit tightly and sewn with waterproof stitches, creating a suit of clothing that was warm, dry and flexible in conditions where the heavy wool garments of the Norse became sodden and freezing. The Norse, for reasons that archaeologists still debate, never adopted any of these technologies. They never learned to build kayaks. They never used toggling harpoons. They never made Inuit-style clothing. They clung stubbornly to their European technologies and their European farming practices even as the climate worsened, and those practices became less and less viable. This cultural rigidity may have been their undoing. Whether the relationship between the Norse and the Inuit was hostile, cooperative, or simply competitive is unclear from the archaeological evidence, but the Inuit were better adapted to the worsening climate and the marine-based subsistence that the Little Ice Age demanded, while the Norse stubbornly clung to their European farming practices, raising cattle in a land that was becoming too cold for cattle, growing hay in a land where the growing season was shrinking year by year. In the end, the Norse of Greenland either died, emigrated, or were absorbed into the Inuit population. The archaeological evidence suggests that the end was gradual rather than sudden. A slow decline over decades as the climate worsened. The supply ships stopped coming. The younger generation saw no future in the colony, and families drifted away one by one, some perhaps to Iceland, some perhaps to the Inuit communities that were thriving in the same region where the Norse were failing. The last Norse Greenlanders did not go out with a bang. They went out with a whisper, and when they were gone, the door to the west closed for the last time. The Greenland colony had been the stepping stone to Vinland, the launch pad from which the Norse had reached North America. Without Greenland, there was no bridge to the west. The ocean was too wide, the voyage too dangerous, and Europe was too busy with its own crises, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, the collapse of the medieval order, to care about a frozen island on the edge of the world, let alone the strange forested land that lay beyond it. For 400 years the Atlantic was an uncrossed barrier again. The Norse had proved it could be crossed, but the knowledge died with the colonies. The stepping stones crumbled one by one, Vinland first, abandoned after 15 years, then the western settlement in Greenland, abandoned in the mid-1300s, then the eastern settlement sometime in the mid-1400s. Then even the memory of the route was lost, because the sailors who knew it were dead and their children had moved away or died without passing on the knowledge. The Atlantic closed like a wound healing, the water smooth and unbroken, as if no ship had ever crossed it. And in the harbours of Lisbon and Cadiz and Seville, a new generation of European sailors was building a new generation of ships, developing new navigational technologies, drawing new maps, and looking south, down the coast of Africa, searching for a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. They had no idea that a continent was waiting in the west, They had no idea that it had been found before. The chain of Norse knowledge, stretching from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to Vinland, each link connected to the next by living memory and practical experience, had broken. And so the Norse discovery of America was forgotten. Not lost in the dramatic sense. The sagas survived. The stories were written down. Scholars in Iceland and Scandinavia knew about them. But the knowledge did not penetrate the wider European consciousness. The Portuguese and Spanish navigators who were pushing the boundaries of European exploration in the 1400s, sailing down the coast of Africa and eventually across the Atlantic, had no idea that the Norse had preceded them by 5 centuries. Columbus did not know. He could not have known. It is one of history's great ironies that the man who is celebrated as the discoverer of America, whose arrival on October 12, 1492, is commemorated as a holiday in the United States, was preceded by nearly 5 centuries by a Norse explorer whose own national holiday, Leif Erikson Day, falls on October 9th and passes almost entirely unnoticed. Leif Erikson Day was established by the United States Congress in 1964, a quiet acknowledgement that the history of European contact with the Americas is more complicated and more interesting than the simple Columbus narrative suggests. But the holiday has never captured the public imagination the way Columbus Day has, partly because the Norse discovery did not lead to permanent colonization, partly because the saga sources were unknown to most people outside of Scandinavia until the 19th century, and partly because the idea that Vikings reached America before Columbus is still, in some quarters, treated as a novelty or a curiosity, rather than as one of the great stories of human exploration. The Norse discovery was a European secret, locked away in Icelandic manuscripts in a language that almost no one outside Scandinavia could read, waiting to be rediscovered by scholars who would not come for another 400 years. And this is where I want to let the story settle, because it is getting late, and the wind outside your window sounds a little like the wind that blew across that grassy terrace at Lonso Meadows 1,000 years ago. And the darkness gathering at the edges of your room is the same darkness that gathered at the edges of the Norse longhouse when the fire burned low and the stories were finished, and the settlers pulled their furs around their shoulders and listened to the ocean and the wind and the silence of a continent that was holding its breath. The Norse came to America and they left. The door opened and the door closed. And for 500 years the continent went on as it had before, the forests growing, the rivers running, the salmon spawning, the Beothuk paddling their red ochre canoes along the coast of Newfoundland, the caribou herds migrating across the barrens of Labrador, the eagles circling over the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the seasons turning and turning and turning in the ancient rhythm that had governed this land for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, and would govern it for 5 centuries after they left. It is tempting to think of the Norse visit as a failure, but I think it is something else. I think it is a reminder that discovery is not the same as conquest. The Norse discovered America. They did not conquer it. They did not claim it in the name of any king. They did not plant a flag. They did not enslave anyone. They did not introduce diseases that would decimate the population. They came. They looked. They built some houses. They traded some cloth for some furs. They fought a few skirmishes. They lost a few men and they went home. The continent absorbed them and then forgot them, the way a lake absorbs a stone that someone throws into it. A splash, some ripples, and then stillness. And the stillness lasted for 500 years. Let me take you through one more evening at Lonso Meadows before we let the story go, because I want you to feel the weight of this moment. The last autumn before the Norse decided to leave, when the settlement was still occupied, and the fires were still burning, and the sounds of daily life still filled the air, but the decision had already been made, or was about to be made, that this place was not sustainable, that the Scraelings were too many, and the supply line too long, and the colony too fragile, and that it was time to go home. It is a September evening. The light has that particular quality that northern light gets in autumn, golden and low and horizontal, making everything cast long shadows and glow with an amber warmth that feels like an apology for the cold that is coming. The bay is burnished copper. The birch trees behind the settlement have turned yellow, and the blueberry bushes on the meadow have gone crimson, and the whole landscape is on fire with colour, the last extravagant gesture of the growing season before the frost shuts everything down. You're sitting outside the longhouse on a flat rock looking at the bay, and you're thinking about Greenland. You're thinking about the deep fjords and the sheep on the hillsides and the people you left behind. You're thinking about the fact that tomorrow, or next week, or whenever the wind is right, you're going to climb into the ship and leave this place and never see it again. And you feel something that you did not expect to feel. You feel sadness. Because this place, for all its dangers, for all its strangeness, for all the nights when you lay awake listening for the Scraelings in the forest, this place is beautiful. It is green and abundant and mild, and it has given you food and timber and fish and berries and a winter that was easier than any winter you have ever known. You have built something here. You have made something out of nothing, on a shore that no one in your world has ever seen. And now you're going to leave it. You're going to pull up the stakes and load the ship and sail away, and the grass will grow over the hearths, and the turf walls will settle and collapse, and the brook will keep running past the empty buildings, and the ravens will perch on the ridge beams, and the wind will blow through the doorways, and nobody will ever live here again. Not your people, anyway. The Bethok will come back eventually, and use this site for their own purposes, and the grassy terrace will absorb both stories, Norse and Bethok, into the deep silence of a landscape that has been absorbing human stories for 9,000 years, and will go on absorbing them long after everyone alive today is gone. Close your eyes now. The longhouse is dark. The fire has burned down to coals. The wind is still blowing. It is always blowing on the northern tip of Newfoundland, but it has become part of the silence rather than a disturbance, a steady presence that you have stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. The other settlers are asleep around you. You can hear them breathing, the slow, deep breathing of people who have worked hard all day and who have no reason to stay awake. The soapstone oil lamp by the door has burned down to a faint blue flicker. The darkness is complete. Outside, the bay is still. The tide is going out, and you can hear the faint suck and hiss of water on the beach, the oldest sound in the world, the sound that this shore has been making since long before any human being heard it. The stars are out, the same stars that the Norse navigated by, the same stars that the Beothuk watched from their camps along the coast, the same stars that are outside your window right now if you look. Polaris is there, the North Star, the one fixed point in the turning sky, the star that told the Norse which way was north when they were lost on the open Atlantic with nothing but water and fog in every direction. The Milky Way is there, arching across the sky like a river of light, and the Norse called it Vetrabrot, the winter way, and they used it to orient themselves on clear nights when the sea was calm and the ship was drifting, and the only sound was the creak of timber and the slap of small waves against the hull. The same sky, the same stars, the same darkness. 1,000 years ago, a man lay in a turf house on this shore and looked up at this sky through the smoke hole in the roof and wondered what lay to the west, beyond the forest, beyond the hills, beyond the horizon. He did not know. He would never know. His people would leave this place and never return, and the secret of what lay to the west would remain a secret for 5 more centuries. But tonight you know. You know what was out there. You know about the forest that stretched for 1,000 miles. You know about the rivers teeming with salmon, and the plains dark with bison, and the cities built from earth, and the pyramids in the Mississippi Valley, and the totem poles on the Pacific coast, and the igloos on the Arctic ice. You know about the 60 million people who lived there, the 300 languages they spoke, the civilizations they built, the world they created. You know all of it, and knowing it, you can let it go. You can let the darkness close over it the way the darkness closed over Lonso Meadows 1,000 years ago, the way the grass grew over the foundations and the earth reclaimed the hearths, and the ocean kept washing the same beach, and the wind kept blowing over the same terrace, and the ravens kept calling from the same spruce trees, year after year after year, as if nothing had happened, as if nobody had ever been there at all. The fire is out now. The longhouse is dark. The settlement is asleep. The continent is asleep. And somewhere across the ocean, in the fjords of Norway, in the farmsteads of Iceland, in the ice-bound colonies of Greenland, the people who came here are sleeping too, and they are dreaming of a land of green grass and wild berries and rivers full of fish. A land they found and lost. A land that waited 500 years to be found again. A land that is still here, right now, under your feet, under your bed, under the building you are lying in tonight. The same land, the same soil, the same darkness. If you have enjoyed this journey to the edge of the Norse world, you can gently tap like. You can leave a comment and tell me where you are tonight, what time it is, what the weather is like outside your window. If you want to walk with us regularly into these stories about the world that was here before ours, you can subscribe, and if you feel moved to support the channel in a deeper way, there is the option to join as a member. But truly being here, listening, resting, drifting towards sleep as the wind blows over a grassy terrace at the northern tip of Newfoundland, that is already enough. Rest now. The longhouse is quiet. The fire is out. The bay is still. The shore is dark. The continent is sleeping, and so can you,